Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, returning to part 3 of my Let's Play, or I guess it's a Let's Play now. It started out with the first two parts as really kind of an initial impressions series where I was looking at just my thoughts and the general gameplay of how Order of Battle Pacific, the new turn-based strategy or turn-based war game made by the Aristocrats and published by Matrix Games and Slytherin, kind of played and felt. Now that we're into the third part of the series, I think this is turning into more of a Let's Play. The first two parts focused heavily on my gameplay and my interpretations of the game. I'm going to start mixing in historical discussions as well into the series as this progresses, much in the vein of my Commander the Great War series, which looked at, or looks, it's not over yet, looks at the First World War in that game. Which I do intend to return to. I'm just waiting for some patchwork to be done to fix a problem that's been causing me to be a bit stalled in the entire thing. But that's kind of neither here nor there. We're returning to Order of Battle Pacific. We are in the third video of the series. This is actually the second scenario. It's the drive on Manila. We're driving from northern Luzon toward Manila, which is kind of toward the southern, I guess, southern half, south central, I guess, of Luzon. My geography is a little bit off, and I may not be describing it all that well. But essentially, we're driving south with the 14th Army of the Japanese military. After the initial successful landings that the Japanese staged, we're now driving on Manila. Now, this, as I mentioned, is the third video in the series. It's actually the second of the drive on Manila. So the first video looked at the Battle of Pearl Harbor, and I thought was a very adequate first scenario from the Japanese side, I felt anyway, that it played really well, felt authentic, and did a good job of making you really feel like you're there while also teaching you the basics. Part 2 of my series focused on the first half of the drive on Manila, so you'll notice here we're already into turn 26. I played the first 25 turns over about 48 minutes in my last video, and now we're in the third video of the series. Still the second scenario, though, still the drive on Manila, and that's where we're at right now, about halfway through this particular battle. However, the video may be much shorter depending on how quickly we succeed or fail, for that matter. Although if we fail, I imagine it'll be a longer video. We've taken 3 of our 5 objectives. We only have, I believe it's Manila and I don't know the name of the city, another city in the south. One thing I really wish the game would do is name the cities rather than just have floating flags over cities, which you kind of have to guess at what they are. But there you have it. Anyway, we've completed the 26th turn. We're working toward the 27th. We're working on finishing up this American and Filipino resistance on our left side of the map, our right flank, but for the purpose of the game, it's on the left side of the map from what we can see. So really, I guess we'll call it our left flank. On our right flank, we're working on reducing an individual Filipino city because the Americans, actually the previous turn, or a couple of turns ago, hit us with some armor in the flank and seriously imperiled our units there. So I don't just want to leave this one city on its own. I don't want them to potentially swoop in behind us and try and take some objective cities. You can see here we've successfully secured our left flank now and are beginning to drive on the second to last objective point here. The objective points, if you forget from the last video, are denoted by a flag with a star over the top and also a gold base that the flag stands in. So on the very bottom left of the screen you can see one of the objectives that remains. Meanwhile, our armor is surprisingly having pretty substantial success attacking these enemy infantry troops in a city, which is interestingly enough. And yeah, that's where we're at. As far as what this video is going to focus on, my guess is this video will be a bit shorter than the previous ones, but I did want to start ever so slowly working our way into historical discussion while still kind of discussing my thoughts of the game as well. But I thought it would be interesting to start discussing the war. Now, the next video, assuming we win here, will probably be a much more historical-focused topic. I haven't had a whole lot of time to research the historical campaign of Japan and the Philippines. Unfortunately, it's not an area that I honestly know a ton about, but it's interesting because in a little bit of cursory research, I learned that the Japanese, when they actually landed on the island, were outnumbered by the local forces that they fought against by about 20,000 men. You would assume, since the Japanese won on the Philippines campaign, where they defeated the American and Filipino defenders quite decisively, wiping out an entire army, taking tens of thousands of people prisoner, and putting them on the infamous Bataan Death March to prison camps after their success in early 1942. You would think that such a campaign would have the Japanese have an overwhelming manpower advantage, but there really wasn't one. It was rather a qualitative advantage, which isn't something that we typically think about when we think about World War II. We think about how advanced America's military technology was, how superior the aircraft were, the ships were, the tanks maybe less so, although certainly superior to what Japan fielded, and just a general qualitative edge to the Americans. But interestingly enough, the Philippines caught the Americans somewhat off guard, not because they didn't anticipate problems there. Actually, rather than thinking that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor, most Americans figured that the Japanese would launch an attack, maybe even a surprise attack, but that it would probably be focused against overseas American assets, such as the Philippines, rather than Pearl Harbor itself. As it was, the Japanese did both. They launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, they launched offensives against the United States in the Philippines, and even launched offensives against the British in Singapore. It was quite an amazing logistical feat for the Japanese to be able to launch so many separate attacks almost simultaneously against such a wide swath of territory. It really shows the advantage of having a naval dominance over the seas and the flexibility that affords you. It also really dispels a lot of the myths of kind of the backwards Japanese army. There's certainly a perspective of that many would seem to have, that the Japanese military, while fanatical, was somewhat lacking in technology. And while by the end of the war that may have been true, certainly in certain aspects, such as like the armor units that the Japanese fielded, they certainly were not up to caliber of the Americans. Even the naval units, in terms of radar and other advanced technologies, the Japanese were often behind. But it wasn't always so, and it certainly wasn't the case that the Japanese were backwards technologically speaking. Or even equipping speaking. The Japanese had a very professional and modern force, and actually were much better equipped than the Americans, much better equipped than the arsenal of democracy at the start of the war. When the Japanese invaded the island of Luzon in late 1941 in December, the Americans had something like 70,000 troops on the island between the Filipino soldiers, the American regular military soldiers, the constabularies, which are kind of like the reserve of the Philippines based on what research I've looked at. Essentially, they had about 70,000 troops. However, of all the troops that they had, the American forces and the Filipino forces were horribly undermanned. Douglas MacArthur had requested 80,000 M1 Grands, which is one of the most modern, if not the most modern, soldier rifle during the Second World War. A semi-automatic 8-round rifle fed with a clip that allowed continuous firing, semi-automatic style, until the clip ran out, whereas most other countries at this time, including the Japanese, were using bolt-action rifles instead as their primary infantry sidearm. So he had requested 80,000 M1 Grands, but the military actually declined it, partially for procurement reasons. They couldn't get enough of them, partially for budgeting reasons, but essentially the bulk of the Filipino army was still using World War I era British Enfield rifles. Interestingly enough, they weren't using the Springfield. The Americans were using the Springfield, but a lot of the Filipino troops were using Enfield rifles made by the British. That wasn't necessarily behind what the Japanese had to offer, but it certainly wasn't an advantage that the Americans could have had. If they had the M1 Garand, especially being placed on the defensive, that additional firepower really could have come in handy and played a very, I wouldn't say a decisive role, because the Japanese controlled the sea lanes, which would have made resupply a nightmare, but it certainly would have played havoc with the Japanese on the offensive, could have really set them back substantially and changed the entire nature of the war. As it was, there were very few M1 Garands in use on the Philippines during the campaigns of 1941 and 42. In addition to that, And perhaps much more importantly, the Filipino troops and the American troops were dramatically undergunned when it came to artillery. The military troops on the island only had about 20% of what a peacetime division should have in terms of artillery. This was not a situation that was replicated on the Japanese side. They had all the weapons they need. They had full equipment or allotment of equipment. The Japanese put some of their best and most well-equipped divisions into the campaign. That included armor, included air units, it included artillery, all in abundance. The Japanese looked more like the American Army in 44 versus the Japanese than they did the Japanese versus the Americans when the campaign was launched in 1941. In fact, the artillery situation was so bad that there were several entire divisions of Filipino troops that didn't have a single field artillery piece. Can you imagine that? In the 1940s, a division of troops, that being over 8,000 men, with no artillery support at all. The situation was replicated when it came to other support weapons. So essentially, this is interesting because at the early or late 1930s, there was a very weak Filipino army, only a couple of divisions. The bulk of the defense was made up by the Philippine division of about 10,000 troops. And this was quickly augmented. As I said, there were over 70,000 troops that were meeting the Japanese invasion when it took place in 41, but they were a brand new army with limited training, with limited equipment, not prepared for war in any stretch of the imagination, while the Japanese coming ashore were some of the best units in the entire Japanese army. So I thought that was an interesting comparison because usually when you think of American forces in World War II, sometimes you think some of their equipment like tanks were out of date, but you almost never think of them being under-equipped or undergunned. If anything, the one thing that they never are short on is artillery. The Americans just sort of have this reputation of having infinite artillery support, infinite ammunition, and during the Philippines campaign that simply was not the case. Another thing that I found interesting in just kind of my cursory research was that the Japanese actually, after the initial drive through the Philippines and through Luzon, when the Americans were bottled up in Bataan, they thought they had more or less won the battle and actually redeployed substantial parts of their 14th Army, which was the force launching the attacks on Luzon, or the main high-quality force. They redirected them to other theaters, and that may have also played a role in the American and Philippine defense, being able to hold out essentially until, I think it was May of 1942, because the Japanese pulled out over half of their air forces and a substantial amount of artillery equipment and infantry as well. So the Japanese just kind of kept the Americans bottled up but didn't really do anything there, and as a result, that tied up substantial forces of the Japanese here. Now, I'm not going to go and say that that would have made a big difference in the campaign, because I really don't think it would have. Additional troops for the Japanese at the time, they were probably advancing in as many places as they could, as quickly as they could, given the logistical situation, but still an interesting point in fact. The Philippines actually was one of the key reasons the Japanese decided they needed to go to war with America, because the real places that Japan wanted to get were the Dutch East Indies, which were to the southwest of the Philippines, but the Philippines was essentially astride the lane of communications and the lane of shipping that would have to go between the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. And the Japanese were worried that in the event of a conflict with America, the Philippines would basically allow the Americans to blockade or cut the Japanese off with ease from the resources that they would gain in the Dutch East Indies. And that's really, a valid concern, because it wouldn't take too strong of an air force to close the seas between these areas. They'd have to take a huge diversion in order to avoid the Philippines. That probably wouldn't have been practical at all. So the fact is, the Japanese, after the American embargoes against them due to their attacks on China, which were largely spurred by public reaction after the Nanking massacres, the Japanese essentially had to deal the Philippines a blow, because it sits right along the shipping routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan. And the fact is, the Japanese absolutely needed the Dutch East Indies once the American embargoes hit after the Japanese attacks in China, because the Japanese didn't produce any oil locally. So if the Americans weren't going to sell Japan oil anymore, they needed to take some by force. There was oil there in abundance in the Dutch East Indies, and as a result, the Japanese decided to strike at America. They needed the Philippines to be pacified without American air power, and they needed to take those islands to secure the flank of their shipping routes. And then they figured, well, if we're going to go to war with America, the only hope that we have is to knock out their Pacific fleet early, so that when we do end up in a war with them, we basically have free reign. And that's essentially what happened. The Japanese had free reign for the 6 months period. You know, that famous quote by Yamato saying that he would run around the Pacific basically at will for 6 months, and then after that, who knows, that, you know, they had woken a sleeping giant, as they had, and kind of the rest was history. But the Philippines, which was formerly a Spanish colony, being taken by the United States and being occupied by the United States, almost ensured American intervention when the U.S. cut off oil sales to Japan. That's not in any way suggesting that the United States is to blame for World War II, because obviously the Japanese are the ones who are running around and attacking. But it definitely paints a different perspective on the impact that embargoes can have. I'm generally pretty skeptical of embargoes. I'm not one of those type of people who says, yeah, let's embargo so-and-so because it'll make them do what we want, because often there's so many loopholes and ways around embargoes that make them very ineffective. But the other potential consequence, other than the embargoes being ineffective, is the fact that it could do the exact opposite of what you're hoping. Rather than the enemy caving to your will and to your desires, the enemy may well find another way that they can accomplish their desires, perhaps through attacking you. And in that sense, embargoes can be incredibly destabilizing, and it's always worth keeping those types of things in mind when politicians are throwing around embargoes, because I almost feel like a lot of them lose perspective. What does this really do? If we really cripple this country's economy, or if the embargo sets in place the conditions that will eventually cripple this country's economy, what do we think they're going to do? Do they think it's going to be less painful and possibly successful for them to strike out even more aggressively? Or will they actually bend to the wishes that we want? A lot of times it's hard to say. But this isn't really a video about embargoes. This is a video about Order of Battle Pacific. So you can see here we took our second to last objective just a few turns ago. We are now advancing to the south. It's like against Inkata or something like that. Sen Inkata or some city along those lines. Essentially, we're advancing south with our entire force against the one remaining location. 2 rivers split between it make it a difficult position to assail. Heavily dug-in troops also make it a difficult position to assail while we're using our tanks here to secure our flank. With that said, I'm not too worried about any counterattacks from the Americans. We've had pretty a good amount of success thus far. One thing I'll say is interesting is I don't see like any kind of experience building up with a lot of my units, and I am giving them elite replacements, so they shouldn't be losing experience, but I just don't see any like stars filling up, and I wonder how many times you have to attack to gain a star, or if maybe that experience is only applied after the fact. I'm not quite sure, but we are slowly going to break down, focus our fire on a couple of key units, and slowly break down the American line. So I think what we'll do is we'll focus our artillery and our infantry assaults against one unit, just kind of slowly break that down, destroy that, and then move on to the next unit, so that we focus our fire all on one spot against one unit, essentially all at once, and then we'll gain a advantage here. Now, a lot of this discussion here today so far has really just been kind of a high-level overview of historical discussions, but I would like to kind of change things up and bring in the occasional video like we had. Again, I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I'd really like to emulate my Commander the Great War series a bit in kind of very in-depth historical discussions. So we may do that with the next video, with the whatever the next battle is. I'm hoping it's another Filipino battle, just because I'd really like the ability to kind of discuss in more detail, once I have some time to research it a bit more, the actual historical campaign. But we'll find out. I honestly have no idea. Meanwhile, a lot of these infantry are really well dug in, so I'm not reducing these lines as quickly as I would like. We just passed the point which we can earn that 35 turns or less achievement by defeating the enemy within 35 turns. Not quite sure what that nets you. Obviously, it would make it more of a major victory. It's one of the secondary objectives that you would achieve. Maybe it allows you to jump ahead and skip the next scenario and just defeat the Philippines, or maybe it gives you a better chance of attacking Bataan. I'm not sure. But I do know that one of the big features, and I mentioned this in the previous videos, but one of the really big features to me, I haven't seen it marketed a whole lot, but one of the features that I think is really awesome is the fact that the game allows there to be carryover effects from previous battles in more than just experience in units, but it also allows you to carry over impacts. So for the Americans, if they shoot down a certain number of aircraft at Pearl Harbor, at least according to the rules, according to the game, and according to kind of the achievement itself, that will cause the Japanese to have lower quality fighter aircraft, at least for the next couple of turns, kind of simulating the loss of experienced airmen, which I think is absolutely awesome that there is that secondary feature. Anyway, I hope this isn't too much rambling here in this video. I will be honest, I am consuming some Tullamore Dew. I had given the whiskey a little bit of a shot here. I haven't had too much in the way of Irish whiskey previously. I wouldn't call myself a huge whiskey fan. Don't drink it that often, but I do enjoy a little bit of Jameson, and I wanted to give something else a shot. I will say it's pretty similar to Jameson from what little I know of whiskey. It seems a very similar style. But anyway, this isn't really an alcohol podcast. Or not, it's not even a podcast. Although that might be an interesting video to do. Do some, war gaming while drinking or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, so you can see here we destroyed one of the units next to, I don't even know if this is, I think this is like San Inglata or something like that, next to the city here down on the end, the last objective point. You can see here we've got some pretty worn out units up front here with a 5 and a 4 on our front lines, while we've got some fresh units in the rear. They've also been suppressed. They've got a yellow and a red or orange or what have you text there indicating their effectiveness will be quite dramatically reduced. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull these guys out. We're going to replace them at the front with some new fresh infantry, and then we're going to shift our line west a little bit to shorten our line up to get those guys off the front line and keep a united, fully equipped force up front. Meanwhile, we'll start bringing these bombers further south, and we'll equip the guys we pulled off the front line as well. We could launch attacks against the Filipino troops on their right flank, but I'd rather not waste the infantry that I could potentially be using against whatever city this is. Meanwhile, we'll start the preparatory bombardments with both of our artillery pieces beginning to attack, and also the first infantry attack here, where you see here we had a pretty good success there, wearing them down, knocking out knocking out 3 of their units, and hopefully maybe next turn the bombers will be in range. If not, we'll just continue to hammer them with artillery. Meanwhile, the American bombers are very ineffective to begin with. Granted, they're only at half strength, but not doing much in the way of just flying around, bombing, and doing very little. So we'll go ahead and continue those artillery bombardments. You can see we've suppressed the Americans into a yellow, and now that the last attack went through, they're heavily suppressed down to kind of that orangish, kind of very disorganized, heavily suppressed level. Meanwhile, on the other flank, we continue to attack this Filipino city, and we just took it. We can advance south. You can see there's a pillbox if we need to swing in around the Americans and cut them off. The bombers are just out of range, and that's where we're at on turn 40. We've already failed to meet our kind of major victory objective, which would have been to take the city within a couple of 35 turns, I think. But we're now into 1942. You can see we're on January 6, 1942, so we can start upgrading some of our units to their 1942 variants, which will make them more combat effective. Very similar to Panzer Corps in that way. And I think we're just about ready to finish it up. I'm going to guess this next turn here, turn 40 or 41, whatever it is, will probably be the last, especially since the American units in that city decided for whatever reason to launch an attack and nearly kill themselves. They've only got 3 left. Our artillery will make short work of them. And yeah, we took the city, so that should give us a victory here. So that's going to probably come close to wrapping it up. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion in this video. Let me know what you thought. I want to get into more in-depth historical discussion. It was a pretty superficial talk today, but still, a little bit more than just talking about gameplay alone. Yeah, there you have it. So we took the city. The game should end after this turn. If it doesn't, we've got some plans to keep moving south But my guess, my understanding, the way the scenarios work is it'll end here after this turn. We won't play out the full 50. Yep, there you see. Word has come that Manila was abandoned by the time our southern invasion force reached the city. It has become clear that the enemies retreated to Bataan in order to make their last stand on the peninsula. So I'm going to guess that next campaign battle will be in Bataan, and yes, it will. So the next battle will be the Battle of Bataan. I appreciate you guys tuning in. This was a bit shorter of a video, but I still hope you enjoyed it. Leave me your feedback, your thoughts, and whatever in the description in the comments thread. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.